New York's most feared billionaire opens the wrong door and sees what the whole city has been hiding: a woman, a wardrobe of bruises that don't lie. The man who built an empire on control suddenly can't control a single thing. Not his rage, not his hands, not the decision forming in his chest like something ancient and irreversible. She says she fell. He knows she didn't. And the man who put those marks on her, the city calls him a hero. Tonight, that changes. Drop a comment with your city. Let's see how far this story travels. Hit like, follow, and don't you dare leave before the ending. Book. The elevator doors opened on the 34th floor at exactly 7:14 p.m., and Lucien Voss stepped out carrying nothing but a single folder, and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from physical labor, but from spending 12 consecutive hours making decisions that would reshape the financial architecture of 3 different industries before most people finished their morning coffee. He was 41 years old. He had the kind of face that looked like it had been assembled with precision rather than born: angular jaw, dark eyes set deep beneath a brow that rarely moved regardless of what he was thinking, a mouth that had learned somewhere around his late 20s that stillness communicated more than expression ever could. He wore his suits the way other men wore armor, not for vanity, for distance. The 34th floor of the Voss Financial Center was administrative, executive support, private conference rooms, the kind of curated silence that costs more per square foot than most Manhattan apartments. At this hour, it was largely empty. The charity gala downstairs had already pulled most of the building's staff into the ballroom on the second floor, where 300 of New York's most carefully curated egos were currently arranging themselves around tables that cost more to dress than most families spent on groceries in a year. Lucien was supposed to be down there. He had 40 minutes before his absence became a problem. He took the hallway toward his private office to leave the folder on his desk, and that was all he intended. 30 seconds, in and out, then back into the performance. He'd been doing it long enough that it no longer felt like performance. It just felt like Tuesday. The door to the private wardrobe suite at the end of the corridor was cracked open. Not much. 2 inches, maybe 3, the kind of gap that happens when a latch doesn't catch fully and a draft pulls it slightly away from the frame. He wasn't going to stop. He almost didn't. What made him pause was the sound. Not a voice, not movement, but the specific quality of silence that exists when someone is trying very hard not to make any sound at all. He'd learned to recognize that silence a long time ago, in rooms and situations that had nothing to do with corporate towers or charity galas. It was the silence of someone holding themselves together by will alone. He pushed the door open. Elena Hartwell stood with her back partially toward him, one hand gripping the edge of a clothing rack, the other pressing her loosened evening blouse against her chest. She'd been in the middle of changing. The blouse she'd been wearing hung open from her shoulders, the back of it fallen away. And for a moment, Lucien didn't understand what he was looking at because his mind refused to process it as real. Then it did. Her back, her arms, the skin along her left shoulder, her right forearm, the curve of her ribs visible along her side. Purple. Yellow-green at the edges of older ones. A constellation of damage laid across her skin with the unmistakable geometry of fingers, of grip, of deliberate force applied to a human body over a sustained period of time. Not 1 bruise, not 2. He stopped counting at 9. Elena turned her head and saw him, and the sound she made was not a gasp. It was something quieter, and worse than that, a small, involuntary intake of breath followed by absolute stillness, the way an animal goes still when it realizes the thing watching it is too close to run from. Then she pulled the blouse closed. Mr. Voss, her voice was level. Cost her something to make it that level. He could see the cost in the set of her jaw, in the way her knuckles had gone white against the fabric. I didn't hear you come up. The door was open. I'll be ready in 5 minutes. I was just... Elena. She stopped. The way he said her name, not loud, not soft, just deliberate. The way you say a word when you need it to carry more weight than its syllables can hold, made her go very still again. It's nothing, she said. I fell last week. The ice outside my building? Don't. The single word came out flat and final, without anger, which somehow made it harder to argue with than anger would have been. Elena's throat moved. She turned fully toward him now, The blouse pulled closed and her fingers locked around the fabric at her sternum, and she lifted her chin in that particular way she had. The way Lucien had catalogued over 11 months of working alongside her without ever once allowing himself to examine why he catalogued it. That said, she had decided to hold her ground regardless of what it cost her. "It's nothing," she said again. He looked at her. He let the silence do the work. Elena Hartwell was 33, and she carried herself with the specific kind of composure that doesn't come naturally. The kind that gets built, layer by careful layer, by someone who learned early that composure was the only currency that couldn't be taken from you. She was sharp in the way that people who've had to be sharp to survive are sharp. Not performatively, not academically, but functionally. The kind of intelligence that reads rooms and people and subtext simultaneously and files everything away for later use. She'd been his executive assistant for 11 months and 3 weeks. She was the most capable person on his staff by a margin he'd never bothered to quantify, but felt every time she wasn't in the building. He hadn't allowed himself to think about her as anything other than that. He was thinking about it now, and it had nothing to do with what he wanted. It had to do with what he was looking at. "Who did that to you?" he said. It wasn't a question. "I told you. Ice doesn't leave fingerprints." The color left her face so fast it was almost visible, like a tide pulling back from shore. She looked at him for a long moment, and he watched her make a series of calculations, watched her run through the options and the outcomes and the costs of each one, and then he watched her decide. "I need to finish getting ready," she said. "We're expected downstairs. We're not going anywhere until you tell me who did that to you." Something moved behind her eyes. Not quite fear, not quite relief. Something suspended between the two, hovering in the space where a person goes when they've been carrying something enormous for so long that the possibility of putting it down feels more dangerous than continuing to carry it. "Victor," she said, then stopped. Then, "It's complicated." Lucien said nothing. It's not. He's under a lot of stress." The words came out mechanical, rehearsed, the kind of sentence that's been said so many times it has worn smooth in the mouth like river stone. She heard it herself. He watched her hear it. "I know how that sounds. It sounds like you've said it before." She looked away. The folder in his hand felt suddenly absurd, a prop from a different life. He set it on the clothing rack without looking at it. Outside the window, Manhattan was doing what Manhattan did at 7 in the evening in November, glittering indifferently against the dark. A billion lit windows full of lives being lived at angles no one else could see. "Victor Ashcroft," Lucien said. She said nothing, which was confirmation enough. Victor Ashcroft, 46. Cardiothoracic surgeon with a practice at Meridian Medical Center. Founder of the Ashcroft Children's Foundation, which had raised $40 million in the past 3 years for pediatric cardiac care. Face of 3 separate magazine covers in the past 18 months. The kind of man who, when his name came up in a room, caused a certain type of woman to make a specific sound and a certain type of man to straighten slightly, reflexively, as if proximity to his reputation required adjustment. Lucien had met him twice, both times at events similar to the one happening downstairs. Both times he'd felt the particular low-frequency discomfort that comes from spending time near someone who is performing rather than existing, the subtle wrongness of a face in which nothing behind the eyes matches what the face is doing. He'd noted it, filed it, said nothing, because it hadn't been his concern. It was his concern now. "How long?" Lucien said. Elena's jaw tightened. "This isn't—" "How long, Elena?" The silence stretched. Below them, somewhere beneath 30 floors of steel and glass and money, a string quartet was probably playing something elegant and expensive for people who weren't listening. The gala had started 8 minutes ago. 300 people were waiting on the billionaire who was standing in a wardrobe room asking his executive assistant a question she didn't want to answer. 14 months, she said quietly. The number landed in Lucien's chest like something physical. 14 months? He'd hired her 11 months ago, which meant that for the entirety of the time he had known her, every meeting, every 16-hour day, every crisis managed with that particular controlled efficiency that he had come to rely on without ever examining why. She had been coming to work with this underneath her clothes, going home to this, returning the next morning and doing it again. He thought about the time she'd moved carefully around a corner, The time she'd worn long sleeves in September. The one morning, 2 months ago, when she'd come in wearing slightly more concealer than usual, and he'd noted it with the peripheral awareness he applied to everything in his environment, and then immediately, deliberately, looked somewhere else. Because looking was not a thing he permitted himself. He threatened me, Elena said. It wasn't just physical. He controls... She stopped, started again. My brother Evan, he's 10. He has a congenital heart defect. He's been under Victor's care since he was 6 years old. Her voice stayed level, but something underneath it was moving, shifting, the way ground shifts before something larger happens. The surgical team, the treatment plan, the access to the specialists he needs. Victor controls all of it directly. He made sure of it. She looked at Lucien with an expression that was entirely without self-pity, which was the thing that made it hardest to look at. If I leave him, or if I say anything, Evan loses that care. Victor has been very clear about that. The wardrobe room was very quiet. Lucien processed what she'd said with the same systematic precision he applied to everything, taking it apart, examining the structure of it, understanding the architecture of the trap before he decided how to dismantle it. Victor Ashcroft had constructed something elegant and terrible. He'd made himself indispensable to something irreplaceable and then leveraged that position against a woman who would sacrifice anything for her brother. It was the kind of control that didn't require constant violence because the violence was only the reminder. The actual mechanism was fear, which was cheaper and more durable and required almost no maintenance. He's downstairs, Elena said, right now, waiting for me. If I don't go down, you're not going down there. She looked at him sharply. You don't understand. If I don't show up beside him tonight, if I embarrass him in front of these people, he will... She stopped herself. Evan's next procedure is in 3 weeks. I can't risk it. Lucien looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and removed his phone. What are you doing? She asked. Calling Dante. Your security chief? Lucien, you can't... If Victor finds out that you said... Dante, Lucien said into the phone, I need you on 34, now. He ended the call. Looked back at Elena. I'm not going to do anything tonight that puts Evan at risk. I need you to understand that. Whatever happens in that ballroom, your brother's situation doesn't change tonight. You have my word. Elena looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully read, something between desperate hope and the trained skepticism of someone who'd learned that words from powerful men were the cheapest currency in circulation. Your word doesn't protect Evan from Victor, she said. Not tonight, Lucien said, but it's a start. Dante Mercer arrived 3 minutes later, 44 years old, built like something load-bearing, with a face that had absorbed considerable damage over the years and integrated it into a general expression of durable calm. He'd worked for Lucien for 9 years. There was no version of Lucien Voss's world that Dante had not seen and navigated without flinching. He took in the scene in the wardrobe room with the swift, categorizing gaze of someone trained to assess situations rather than react to them, and then he looked at Lucien. We have a problem, Lucien said. I can see that. Victor Ashcroft. Dante's expression didn't change. The surgeon. He's downstairs. He's been... Lucien glanced at Elena, who had finished buttoning her blouse and was now standing with her arms wrapped around herself, watching this exchange with the look of someone observing a conversation in a language they half understand. We need access to Meridian Medical's administrative database, the Pediatric Cardiac Division, treatment authorization records, patient priority files, financial cross-referencing between donation records and treatment scheduling. Dante was quiet for a moment. That's a HIPAA violation. Yes. Federal crime. Yes. Tonight. Before the gala ends. Dante looked at Elena. This what you want? Elena's chin came up. I've been building a file for 4 months, financial records I copied from his home office, patient lists I photographed on his desk. I have enough to show the pattern, but not enough to prove it systemically. Not without the hospital's internal data. Dante considered this with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who understood that rushing decisions in complicated situations was how people ended up in situations considerably more complicated than the one they'd started in. Then he nodded once. I'll need 2 hours and a specific contact inside the hospital's IT department. You have 1 hour, Lucien said. And you have carte blanche on resources. What's the play for the gala? Lucian looked at Elena. She looked back at him. I go down, she said. It wasn't a question. I stand next to him. I smile. I give him no reason to think anything is different. You don't have to. I know what I have to do. Something in her voice had shifted. Not harder, not colder, but more deliberate, the way a person sounds when they've made a decision that has been waiting a long time to be made. I've been doing it for 14 months. I can do it for 1 more hour. Lucian looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his chest that he recognized as rage. Not the hot, explosive kind that made men stupid and loud, but the other kind, the slow, cold kind that burns at a steady temperature and doesn't go out. He'd felt it before in his life, in specific situations involving specific categories of wrong, and he had learned a long time ago that the only useful thing to do with it was to aim it precisely. There are signals, he said. If anything changes, if he does anything, if the situation shifts, I'll handle it. She looked at Dante. He has security tonight, 3 of his own people probably, plus the event team downstairs. I know his security, Dante said simply. Elena almost smiled at that. It didn't reach her eyes, but it got partway there, which was something. She picked up her evening bag from the shelf behind her and checked its contents with the automatic efficiency that characterized everything she did. Compact, phone, small folded envelope that she tucked into the interior pocket without comment. Then she looked at Lucian one more time. For the record, she said, I was going to handle this myself. I know. I've been handling it. I know that too. She held his gaze for another second. Then she walked out of the wardrobe room and toward the elevator, and Lucien watched her go with the particular awareness of someone watching a person walk towards something dangerous, and knowing the only help he could offer was the kind that had to happen quietly, in the background, before it could matter. Dante waited until the elevator doors closed, then, how bad? Bad? The brother? Real leverage. We don't touch that until we have something that makes it irrelevant. Dante nodded slowly. The database. Everything you can get. I want the full picture of what he's been doing to those patients. Not just the brother. All of it. If this goes sideways, it won't. If it does. Lucien looked at him. Then I'll deal with the consequences. That's not your problem. Dante made a sound that might have been acknowledgement or might have been disagreement and was probably both. He was already pulling out his phone. I'll need 30 minutes to set up the access protocol. After that, 60 to pull and verify. You have exactly that. One more thing. Dante paused. Ashcroft is connected. State senators, 2 federal judges. The hospital board is half-stacked with his people. I'm aware. You go at him directly tonight in that room, with those people watching. I'm not going at him tonight, Lucian said. Tonight I'm getting the evidence. What happens after that will look like it happened on its own. Dante studied him for a moment with the evaluating look of someone who has worked alongside a man long enough to know the difference between what the man says and what the man means. Then he pocketed his phone and moved toward the door. 1 hour, he said. 1 hour. The wardrobe room was empty after that. Lucien stood in it for another 15 seconds, longer than was necessary, looking at the place where Elena had been standing when he'd first seen what was underneath her clothes. The clothing rack, the specific angle of the light, the gap in the fabric where the blouse had fallen open. He'd built his empire by understanding leverage, by seeing where pressure could be applied, where structures were weak, where the thing that looked stable was actually balanced on something small and breakable. He'd used that understanding without apology for 20 years because that was the nature of the world he moved in, and he had never once confused it with morality. This was different. He didn't examine why. There wasn't time, and he suspected the examination would not produce any answer that was useful. He picked up his folder from the clothing rack and walked out. The ballroom on the second floor of the Voss Financial Center had been designed by an architect who believed that the purpose of a room was to make the people inside it feel watched, which was a philosophy that worked exceptionally well for charity galas because it kept everyone on their best behavior and loosened wallets considerably. Crystal chandeliers hung at intervals above tables dressed in white and gold. The catering staff moved with the precise choreography of people who understood that invisibility was a professional skill. At the far end of the room, a low stage had been set up for the evening's presentations. Lucien entered from the side door at 7:38 p.m. and was immediately absorbed into the social machinery. Handshakes, brief exchanges, the practiced efficiency of someone who understands that a room full of powerful people is a resource to be managed rather than a gathering to be enjoyed. He moved through it with the surface attention it required while the deeper part of him was doing something else entirely, tracking the room, tracking Elena, tracking the man standing beside her near the bar at the room's eastern edge. Victor Ashcroft in person, in a social setting, was a performance Lucien could now read with different eyes. He was tall, good-looking in a way that had been carefully maintained, the kind of face that photographs well and ages in a way that gets described as distinguished. He wore his tuxedo with the ease of someone accustomed to black tie, and he stood with Elena's hand in the crook of his arm with a possessive casualness that looked, from a distance, like affection, and looked from Lucien's current vantage point like exactly what it was. Elena stood beside him and smiled and responded to introductions and was everything the room expected her to be. Lucien watched her do it from 40 feet away while making conversation he didn't care about with people whose names he was processing and discarding, and he felt that cold, steady heat in his chest and kept it where it was. Victor caught his eye across the room, smiled, nodded. The smile was warm and practiced and contained, Lucien now recognized, a very specific quality. The smile of a man who is entirely confident that he controls every relevant variable in his immediate environment. Lucien nodded back. He spent the next 40 minutes being exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what was expected of him, while Dante and two members of his technical security team worked in a van on the parking level beneath the building, accessing a server infrastructure they were not authorized to access, pulling records that were not theirs to pull, building a case that would have to be airtight before it could be used. He did not look at Elena more than was natural. He did not allow his face to do anything his face was not supposed to do. At 8:22 p.m., his phone vibrated once in his jacket pocket. Dante's signal. Access established. The data pull had begun. At 8:31 p.m., something changed. He felt it before he identified it. The specific atmospheric shift that happens in a room when something unexpected has entered, when some variable has moved that shouldn't have moved. He turned slightly and scanned the room and found what he was looking for almost immediately. A member of the event's technical staff moving with unusual purpose toward the AV control station near the stage. And another man, not Lucien's staff, not event staff, someone in a server's uniform who moved wrong, positioned near the room's main screen display. He looked at Victor. Victor was smiling at a senator's wife and had not looked toward the screens, but his right hand, the one not occupied with the senator's wife, was in his jacket pocket, and his thumb was moving. Lucien was already moving when the screens came on. Every display in the ballroom, the main presentation screen above the stage, the smaller screens on the side walls, even the tablet-sized displays at the information tables near the entrance, lit up simultaneously with the same image. A document, financial records, Elena Hartwell's name at the top, account numbers, transfer figures, a letter with official hospital letterhead accusing her of unauthorized data access and misappropriation of patient records. Then a second document, a police report, a photograph, more figures. The ballroom didn't go silent all at once. It went silent in a wave, table by table, as people looked up from their conversations and registered what they were seeing, and the wave of silence carried with it the low-level electrical charge of 300 people simultaneously recalibrating. Lucien stopped moving. Elena had gone completely still where she stood. He could see her from across the room. The particular quality of her stillness, not frozen with shock but locked down with the specific discipline of someone who has just been hit and is deciding in real time how to respond. Victor's hand had come up to her shoulder. From the outside, it looked supportive. Lucien knew what it was. He looked at the screens, he looked at the documents. And then, because he had spent 20 years in rooms where information was weaponized, and he understood instinctively the architecture of a prepared attack, he started to see it. The timestamps, the letter date, the filing date on the police report. Something was wrong with the timeline. Something had been prepared in advance. Around him, the murmur was building, the specific sound of a crowd deciding what to think before it had thought anything yet. Running on the social current of scandal and proximity to scandal, the reflexive movement away from anyone who has become suddenly, publicly, suspect. He watched Victor guide Elena slightly forward, toward the stage, with one hand at her back. guiding, positioning, the posture of a man who had arranged this and was now directing it toward its conclusion. Lucien looked at the screens one more time. The timeline was wrong. He set down his glass, and he began to walk toward the stage with the particular quality of movement he'd developed sometime in his 30s. Not fast, not aggressive, just very steady, with the precise directional certainty of someone who has already decided what happens next and is simply closing the distance between intention and action. At 8:34 p.m., 11 months and 3 weeks after he'd hired Elena Hartwell, Lucien Voss stepped onto the stage of his own charity gala and took the microphone from the evening's host. The room went quiet. Victor's hand, still resting on Elena's back, went very still. "I have a question," Lucien said. His voice came through the sound system at exactly the right volume, present enough to fill the room, controlled enough to sound reasonable. "About these documents." He looked at the screens. He looked at the room. He did not look at Victor. "The letter from Meridian Medical is dated November 3rd, he said. "The police report attached to it was filed November 5th. He paused, letting the room do the arithmetic. "Ms. Hartwell was with me in a board meeting on November 3rd from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m., which 14 people in this room can confirm. And the data access referenced in this police report." He looked down at his phone. A message from Dante arrived 30 seconds ago. 3 words. "We have it." References hospital records that were accessed from a server location in New Jersey. He looked up. "Ms. Hartwell has never, to my knowledge, been to New Jersey." The silence in the room had changed texture. Victor's face had not moved. That was the tell. A man who was genuinely surprised would have moved. Victor Ashcroft's face was a portrait of concerned composure, which was the face of a man who had prepared for this moment and was now executing a contingency. Lucien had one more second before Victor responded, and the narrative shifted again. He looked directly at Elena. She was looking back at him. Across a ballroom full of New York's most powerful people, with fabricated evidence displayed across every screen and her abuser's hand on her back, she was looking at him with an expression he had 11 months of context to read and could not, in this moment, fully interpret. Something between calculation and something rawer than calculation. Something she was keeping locked behind the composure that had never once failed her in the time he'd known her. Her hand moved, barely. A slight shift of her fingers against her evening bag. The envelope she'd tucked into her interior pocket. The one she'd taken from the wardrobe room shelf before coming downstairs. She'd had it all along. Whatever it contained, she'd been carrying it into this room before Lucien had ever come downstairs, before Dante had made a single call, before any of this had been set in motion. She'd been going to do something with it. She'd had a plan. And now she was looking at him with that locked expression while Victor's hand rested on her spine and 300 people waited to decide what to think. And somewhere across the city in a hospital room, a 10-year-old boy with a damaged heart was sleeping through whatever was happening here. And the entire weight of everything balanced on the next 30 seconds in a way that Lucien understood with the deep structural certainty of someone who has spent a lifetime reading the fulcrum points of impossible situations. He held her gaze. Whatever she'd been planning to do alone, she wouldn't have to do alone. But whether she was going to let him in, whether the woman who had been handling things by herself for 14 months was going to accept that the door that had just opened was not another trap, that was not a decision he could make for her. He waited. Her fingers moved again against her bag, and the decision she made in the next 3 seconds would set everything that followed into motion in a direction neither of them could fully predict. With a man whose hand was on her back and whose leverage was in a hospital room across the city, and whose carefully constructed empire was, for the first time, genuinely at risk. The string quartet had stopped playing. The room held its breath. Elena Hartwell looked at Lucien Voss across the ballroom and made her choice. Elena's fingers closed around the envelope. Not a dramatic gesture, not a declaration, just a hand making a decision that the rest of her body had apparently already reached without consulting the part of her that was still running the survival calculus, still measuring Victor's hand on her spine against Evan's hospital records, against the 300 faces in this room that were waiting to be told what to think. She took one step forward, away from Victor's hand. The step was small. Maybe 8 inches. But the hand fell away, and the absence of it on her back was something she felt in her entire nervous system, the way you feel a sound stop rather than hear it start. Victor noticed. Of course he noticed. His attention was the kind that registered everything in his immediate environment with the continuous low-level vigilance of someone who needed to maintain control of every room he entered. She'd learned that about him somewhere around month 3, when she'd still been telling herself that his attentiveness was care rather than surveillance. She knew better now. She felt him recalibrate behind her, felt the shift in the air, the way you feel weather change. Lucienne was still at the microphone. The screen still showed her name above fabricated numbers. Elena opened the envelope. Inside were 7 photographs. She'd taken them on her phone and printed them at a pharmacy 3 blocks from her apartment on a Tuesday morning when Victor had a surgery scheduled and she'd had 45 minutes of guaranteed freedom. The photographs showed documents spread across a mahogany desk, Victor's home office desk, the one he kept locked and she'd learned to open with a dental pick she'd practiced on for 2 weeks using a YouTube tutorial she'd watched on a borrowed phone because she hadn't trusted her own. Patient files, donor correspondence, internal memos from the Ashcroft Foundation, numbers that told a very specific story about the relationship between how much a family donated to Victor's foundation and how quickly their child moved up the surgical priority list. Evan's name was in those files too. Specifically in a memo from 14 months ago that outlined the terms of his continued treatment in language that looked, on the surface, like administrative notation and looked, on closer examination, like the documentation of a threat. She'd been sitting on these for 4 months. She'd been waiting until she had enough, until she was sure, until the moment was right and the exit was clear and Evan was protected enough that she could pull the thread without the whole thing collapsing on him. She hadn't planned for tonight to be that moment. But Victor had moved first. And the thing about being the person who never gets to move first, the thing she'd understood in the particular dark clarity of 4 a.m. on too many nights to count, was that when the moment finally arrived, you recognized it with your whole body before your mind caught up. She walked toward the stage. Victor moved at the same moment from behind her, and she heard the specific weight of his step on the ballroom floor. She knew that footfall, had learned it the way you learn the sound of a door you're afraid to hear open. But she didn't look back, because looking back was the thing you did when you weren't sure, and she was done not being sure. She reached the stage steps as Lucian turned from the microphone. Their eyes met. Up close, in the stage light, she could see something in his face that she didn't have a clean name for. Not pity, which she would have recoiled from, and not the particular kind of concern that men performed when they wanted to be seen being concerned. Something quieter than either, something that looked like it cost him something to show. She held up the photographs. She said, "These are better." He looked at them, looked at her, made a decision in about 2 seconds that she could see moving through him like current. And then he stepped aside from the microphone and she stepped forward. And she was aware of the room in the way she'd been aware of rooms for the past 14 months, as a space full of variables, of exits, of distances between herself and the nearest threat. And then she stopped being aware of it that way and just stood in it. "My name is Elena Hartwell," she said into the microphone. Her voice came out steady. She was slightly surprised by that, and then she wasn't, because the steadiness wasn't calm. It was something harder than calm. Something that had been compressed under pressure for so long it had changed into a different substance entirely. "I've worked for Voss Financial for just under a year. Before that, I was in hospital administration. I met Dr. Ashcroft through my brother's cardiac care." She paused. "My brother Evan is 10 years old. He has a congenital heart defect. Dr. Ashcroft has been his primary cardiologist for 4 years. The room was absolutely still. Victor had stopped moving. She knew without looking that he had stopped. She knew the specific quality of his stillness, the way she knew everything about him, that she'd learned not because she'd wanted to, but because knowing it was survival. 14 months ago, she said, Dr. Ashcroft told me that if I ever disclosed anything I'd seen in the course of our personal relationship, Evan would be removed from his surgical list. She laid the photographs on the podium. These are documents from his home office showing that treatment priority for children at Meridian Medical's Pediatric Cardiac Center has been systematically adjusted based on family donations to the Ashcroft Foundation. Children from families who donate more move faster. Children from families who can't afford to donate wait longer. Her hands were shaking. She noticed it the way you notice something happening to a body you're observing from a slight distance. Evan is in those documents. His continued access to treatment is listed as contingent on my cooperation. Those are the exact words used. My cooperation. A sound moved through the room, not loud, the specific low frequency of 300 people absorbing something at the same moment. Victor's voice came from behind her, close. Closer than she'd anticipated, which meant he'd been moving while she was speaking, which meant she'd miscalculated the distance, and the specific spike of cortisol that produced in her nervous system was something she'd spent 14 months learning to manage and had not yet fully managed. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victor said. He'd taken a secondary microphone from somewhere, from one of his people, she realized, which meant his people had been positioned for this, which meant the contingency had a contingency. His voice was exactly as it always was in public, warm, textured, carrying the specific frequency of a man accustomed to being trusted. "I think we can all appreciate that this is a deeply distressing situation. Elena has been under enormous personal strain, and I take some responsibility for that, because I haven't—" "Don't," Lucian said. One word, no microphone. Somehow it carried. Victor turned toward him with the expression of a man who has decided to be patient. "Lucien, I understand you feel you're helping." "The letter was dated November 3rd, Lucian said. "You prepared it before tonight. You had the screen set up before tonight. You brought your own technical staff into this building." He looked at the room, not at Victor. Just the room. Just 300 people doing math. "You set this up before she did anything, which means you already knew she had something on you, which means you were trying to get ahead of it." He paused. "That's not how innocent people behave." The warmth in Victor's face underwent a very subtle process of revision. It stayed on the surface. Underneath it, something else was visible for anyone looking at the right angle, which Lucienne was, and which Elena, turning now to face him directly for the first time since she'd stepped onto the stage, was. She'd seen that thing underneath his face before. She'd seen it up close. "Elena." Victor's voice had dropped in register, just slightly, enough that it was meant for her rather than the room. Public speech dropped to private speech while 300 people watched, which was itself a kind of threat. A reminder that privacy was an illusion he controlled. "We should talk about this somewhere." "We're done talking somewhere," she said. His jaw moved. Once. The micro-expression she'd learned to read as the thing that came before the other thing, the shift that meant the temperature in the room she was in was about to change in ways she'd gotten very familiar with over 14 months. He reached for her wrist. The room saw it. She saw it. And in the fraction of a second between his hand moving and her instinctive step backward, the step she'd learned to take, the reflexive retreat of a body that had been taught what came after that reach, something happened in the room that she hadn't expected. People moved. Not toward them, not away. Just redistributed. Chairs scraping, bodies repositioning. The atmospheric pressure of 300 people leaning into attention rather than away from it. His fingers closed around her wrist. She didn't make a sound. She was practiced at that. But Lucien was already moving off the stage, and Dante Mercer was already crossing the room from the service entrance with the particular quality of movement that Dante had, unhurried, absolutely certain, the way a physical structure moves. And from somewhere in the middle of the room, a woman's voice said clearly. He grabbed her. 3 words. No theatrics. Just witness. Victor let go. The release was worse, somehow, than the grab. It was the release of a man recalibrating, reassessing, calculating, deciding that this particular tool had become a liability. She knew that release. She knew exactly what it meant for what came next. He looked at her with an expression that the room would read as hurt, and that she read as something altogether different. After everything I've done for your brother, he said. He said it quietly. She didn't think the microphones caught it. She did. She felt it land in her chest the way it was designed to land, in the exact place where love and fear and obligation had been tangled together for long enough that she'd stopped being able to tell them apart. He'd always known where to put the knife. That was the thing about a person who studied you. They learned the geography of you, learned where the soft places were, and they used that knowledge with a precision that had nothing to do with care and everything to do with control. What you did for Evan, she said, You did as leverage, not care. The words came out quiet and entirely level, and she felt them leave her the way you feel. Something put down after a very long time of carrying it. Victor looked at her for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. Then he looked at Lucien, who had stepped off the stage and was standing 8 feet away with the particular quality of stillness that Lucien had. Not passive, not aggressive, just positioned, like something that has decided where it is and sees no reason to move from there. This isn't over, Victor said, to Lucien, not to her. It's not, Lucien agreed. Something in the agreement, its flatness, its absence of threat or performance, made Victor's jaw tighten in a way that was visible. He was a man who was accustomed to controlling the emotional register of his interactions, to setting the temperature, and there was something deeply disorienting for him. She could see it, about a response that refused to enter the temperature he'd set. He turned and walked off the stage. His 3 security people redistributed. She tracked them. The one near the east exit, the one at the bar, the one who'd been near the AV station and was now moving toward the side corridor. Not leaving. Repositioning. She noted this the way she'd learned to note things in the past 14 months. Automatically, economically. The threat mapping of someone who had learned that inattention was a cost she couldn't afford. His people are still in the room, she said to Lucien, low, not looking at him. I see them. He's not done. No. Around them, the room was doing what rooms do after something ruptures inside them. The social machinery attempting to reboot, people turning to their neighbors, the sound of conversation resuming in fragments, uncertain whether it was appropriate to resume or what the appropriate register was. A woman nearby was photographing the stage with her phone. A man in a senator's staff lanyard was on a call, speaking quietly and quickly with one hand shielding his mouth. Dante appeared at Elena's left shoulder. He handed her his phone without preamble. On the screen was a directory tree, file names, timestamps, a folder structure she recognized from the naming conventions of Meridian Medical's administrative system. 93 files, Dante said. Pediatric cardiac, treatment authorization, donor correlation, priority scheduling going back 6 years. We also got internal communications from the Foundation's financial officer from the past 8 months. He paused. It's worse than the photographs. Elena looked at the screen, looked at the first file name, the timestamp, the size of the file. She'd known it was bad. She'd known the shape of it. But knowing the shape of a thing and seeing its actual dimensions were different experiences. And for a moment, the room and the noise and the recalibrating crowd all receded, and she was just standing there with the weight of it settling on her. The weight of 6 years of children waiting longer than they should have because their families couldn't afford to buy their way up a list that was supposed to be about survival, not money. Evan had been in those files for 4 years. Send everything to the New York State Department of Health, she said, and the Federal Office of Inspector General, and... She stopped. Is there a journalist in this room? Dante almost smiled. There are 4. Send one of them the directory. Not the files yet, just the directory. Let them ask for them. Lucien looked at her. What? She said. Nothing. He said it the way people say nothing when they mean the opposite, when they mean something they've decided not to say because the timing is wrong. She noted it and filed it for later. Her phone vibrated in her bag. She pulled it out. Unknown number. She answered anyway, because unknown numbers in the middle of situations like this one tended not to be coincidences. The voice on the other end was male, clipped, institutional. Ms. Hartwell. This is security operations at Meridian Medical. I'm calling to inform you that Dr. Ashcroft has authorized a transfer of care for a patient listed as Evan Hartwell, minor, room 412. The transfer paperwork was submitted 40 minutes ago, and the transport team is currently... She stopped hearing the rest of the sentence. The room tilted. Not physically, internally. The specific kind of tilt that happens when the foundation of something shifts, when the thing you've been protecting and calculating and sacrificing everything to preserve suddenly becomes the weapon being used against you in real time, mid-move, 40 minutes ago, while she was upstairs in the wardrobe room, while Victor was downstairs smiling for photographs. He'd submitted the paperwork before the gala started, before the screens, before any of this. He'd known. He'd known she was going to do something tonight, or he'd prepared for it as a contingency, and either way, he'd been 40 minutes ahead of her the entire time, and Evan was... Where? She said into the phone. Her voice came out wrong. She could hear that it came out wrong, stripped of the levelness she'd maintained for the past 40 minutes, stripped of everything but the thing underneath. Where's the transport taking him? I'm not authorized to... Where's my brother being taken? A pause on the line. Breathing. The specific hesitation of an institutional employee who has just registered that they are inside a situation they didn't anticipate and aren't sure how to navigate. The paperwork lists it as Westfield Pediatric in New Jersey, the voice said. But Ms. Hartwell, there's something else. The authorization includes a psychiatric hold notation on you specifically. It's flagged on the transfer documents that you are not to be permitted medical decision-making authority for the patient pending a... She ended the call. She looked at Lucien. He was already looking at her, had been looking at her, had seen something shift in her face before she'd finished processing what had shifted, and his expression had changed in the fraction of a second it had taken for him to read her. Changed from the watchful stillness to something more immediate, more unguarded, the kind of look that comes before action. Evan, she said. That was all she said. Lucien was already reaching for his jacket. Dante was already moving. And Victor Ashcroft, she understood now, had never intended to fight this battle in a ballroom. The ballroom was a distraction. The screens were a distraction. All of it. The fabricated documents, the public accusation, the performance of outrage, had been designed to keep her in this room, on his stage, fighting his fight. While 40 minutes across the city, a transport team moved her brother to a facility where she would have no legal authority to reach him. He'd outmaneuvered her. Or he thought he had. She looked at Lucien once more, and what she felt in that look, the thing she registered in the 2 seconds before she moved, before Dante cleared the path, and the three of them began moving toward the exit with the particular focused velocity of people who have run out of time for anything except what comes next, was something she had not let herself feel in 14 months. Something she had locked down with the same discipline she'd applied to everything else, because feeling it had felt like one more thing he could use against her. She felt it now. She would deal with what it meant later. Right now, her brother was in a car, and the man who had used him as a weapon for 4 years had just made the last move he was ever going to make. And she had 93 files and 7 photographs, and Lucien Voss moving beside her through a ballroom full of witnesses. She had enough. She was going to end. She was going to end it. That sentence lived in the 3 seconds between the phone call and the exit door, between knowing and moving, between the version of tonight she'd planned and the version Victor had built underneath it, like a second floor she hadn't known existed. The Voss Financial Center's service corridor was narrow and lit with the utilitarian fluorescence of spaces not meant to be seen, and the three of them moved through it at a pace that wasn't quite running because running was panic, and panic was information given to the wrong people. Lucien was on his phone. Dante was 2 steps ahead, one hand already on the exterior door, his other hand at his ear with the subcutaneous earpiece that connected him to the security team outside. Elena was counting. It was the thing she did when the internal machinery was running too fast, when the calculus was too loud. She counted. Steps. Seconds. The specific number of hours since Victor had submitted the transfer paperwork, which the security officer had said was 40 minutes ago, which meant 7:40 p.m., which meant he'd done it before he'd ever come downstairs to the gala, before the screens, before any public move, which meant the public move had never been the real move. She stopped walking. Lucien, 3 steps ahead, turned back. Elena. He filed it at 7:40, she said. The gala started at 7:30. He submitted transfer paperwork for Evan 10 minutes into the event, before I even came downstairs. She looked at Lucien. He didn't do that because he knew I was going to expose him tonight. He did it because he'd already decided to do it, regardless. The corridor was quiet enough that she could hear the muffled string of the quartet still playing somewhere in the building, the sound of a party that hadn't fully registered yet that it wasn't a party anymore. Lucien was very still. He was moving Evan regardless of what happened tonight. He's been planning to move him. This wasn't a response to me. This was... She stopped. The shape of it was assembling itself in her head with the specific, horrible clarity of something you've been not seeing for a long time because seeing it was too expensive. He knew I had something. He's known for a while. And instead of confronting me about it, he decided to remove the leverage entirely. Move Evan somewhere I can't reach him. Have me declared legally unfit to make decisions for him. Then it doesn't matter what I have no authority, I have no access, And without Evan, I have no... She stopped. Without Evan, she had no reason to stay quiet. But she also had no brother. The corridor felt very narrow. Dante pushed the exterior door open and the night air came in cold and immediate. The particular November cold of New York that had no patience for whatever you'd been doing inside. And the three of them moved through it toward the parking structure where two of Dante's vehicles were positioned. Westfield Pediatric, Lucian said into his phone, moving. New Jersey. I need everything on the facility. Ownership, board structure, medical affiliations, and I need to know if Victor Ashcroft has any financial relationship with that hospital. He listened. 15 minutes. Yes. He ended the call and looked at Dante. How long to Meridian Medical? 22 minutes with the route I'm running. Evan's still at Meridian? As of 12 minutes ago. Dante opened the rear door of the first vehicle. The transport was called, but I've got a contact in Meridian's security office who confirms the team hadn't arrived yet when I spoke to him. That was before we left the building. So we have a window. We have a window. Elena got into the vehicle. The door closed. The city outside the tinted windows was doing what it always did, indifferent and enormous, and for a moment she let herself sit inside the specific quality of the stillness that exists in the back of a moving car, when everything outside is moving and you are temporarily, artificially, held still. She pulled out her phone and called Evan's floor at Meridian Medical. It rang 4 times. 5. 6. Then a nurse's voice, professional and slightly hurried, the voice of someone managing more than one thing at once. Pediatric cardiac, 4th floor. This is Elena Hartwell. I'm calling about my brother Evan Hartwell, room 412. I need to speak to his attending nurse. A pause. Longer than it should have been. Miss Hartwell, could you hold for just one moment? I'd rather not. Hold music. Thin, institutional, the particular kind of music chosen for its complete inoffensiveness and achieving instead a kind of aggressive neutrality that made every second of it feel longer than it was. Lucian was watching her. She felt it without looking. The hold music stopped. A different voice. Male. More careful. Ms. Hartwell, this is Dr. Raymond Polk. I'm the charge physician on 4 this evening. The careful quality of the voice was the kind of careful that indicated preparation, a person who had been briefed and was now executing the briefed version of this conversation. I want to let you know that Evan is stable and comfortable and his vitals are excellent. I want to know about the transfer order. A beat. There has been a transfer request submitted by Dr. Ashcroft as Evan's primary... I am Evan's legal guardian. I have medical decision-making authority. Any transfer requires my consent, and I am not giving it. Another pause. This one different in quality. Heavier. Ms. Hartwell, I need to inform you that the transfer documentation submitted by Dr. Ashcroft includes a notation from Meridian Medical's legal department indicating that your medical decision-making authority is under review pending a psychiatric evaluation. Yachit. The sentence arrived in her chest like something structural failing. That notation, she said, was submitted by Victor Ashcroft. The notation was submitted through the hospital's legal department. At whose request? Dr. Polk was quiet. At whose request was that notation submitted? She said again, and her voice had done the thing it did under extreme pressure, gone very quiet, very flat, the way the surface of water goes flat before something underneath it moves. I'm not in a position to... Is my brother being moved tonight? Yes or no? A pause that lasted exactly long enough to tell her everything she needed to know before he said, the transport team is expected to arrive within the next 45 minutes. The documentation is... She ended the call. She looked out the window. The city went past in its efficient blur, lights and concrete, and the specific density of 8 million people going about whatever they were going about while in a hospital across town. A 10-year-old boy with a damaged heart was asleep in room 412, and a transport team was on its way to put him in a vehicle and take him somewhere Elena would not, under the legal framework Victor had just constructed, have any authority to follow. He got to the hospital's legal department, she said. Lucien turned from the front seat. Not just the transfer paperwork. He filed something through Meridian's legal office questioning my competency. It's official documentation now. It's in the system. She felt the words coming out of her with the specific quality of someone reading the terms of something they hadn't agreed to. He's been preparing this for longer than tonight. You don't get hospital legal departments to move on a Friday night in 40 minutes without having laid groundwork. He had this ready. This was... She stopped. This was always the plan. If I ever moved against him, Evan disappears into a facility Victor controls, and I become legally invisible. Lucien said nothing for a moment. Then, how solid is your guardianship documentation? Airtight. I've had it for 6 years, since our parents... She stopped. Started again. It's airtight. But a psychiatric competency challenge, even a bad faith one, takes time to resolve. Weeks. Maybe months. And during that time, Evan is in Victor's facility. Lucien turned back to the front. Dante. Already on it, Dante said from the driver's seat, phone to his ear. I've got a contact at the State Attorney General's emergency line, and I'm running the Westfield pediatric ownership structure now. A pause while he listened to whoever was on the other end of his phone. Then he said, say that again, in a tone that was not quite Dante's normal tone. The specific deviation from his baseline flatness that Elena had learned tonight indicated something more than routine. He listened for another 10 seconds. Then he lowered the phone without ending the call and looked in the rearview mirror. Westfield Pediatric, ownership structure. Tell me, Lucien said. Parent company is Ashcroft Medical Holdings, LLC, registered in Delaware 18 months ago. Dante's eyes in the mirror were steady and without readable expression. Victor Ashcroft is listed as the sole managing member. The vehicle was very quiet. Elena heard herself breathe. In, out. The specific mechanical quality of breathing when the body is doing it without the involvement of the part of you that makes decisions. He owned it. He'd built it. 18 months ago, which was 4 months after they'd started, which was 14 months ago, which meant that within the first few months of whatever they were, whatever she'd believed they were, he had been constructing the infrastructure of a facility to which he could remove her brother if she ever became a problem. He hadn't done this in response to her. He'd done it in anticipation of her, in preparation for the possibility that she would one day stop being manageable. And he had spent 14 months with his hand on her spine and his mouth saying the things mouths say, and underneath all of it, this. A building in New Jersey with his name on the ownership documents, and a bed already, presumably, assigned. Lucien turned around fully in his seat and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before, something that wasn't the controlled watchfulness, and wasn't the cold precision, and was something rawer than either, something that looked almost like it hurt. She looked back at him. How long have you been alone with this? He said. It wasn't the question she'd expected. She'd expected something operational, a next step, a plan. Lucien spoke in plans. She'd worked alongside him long enough to know that his default response to information was forward motion, the immediate translation of data into action. This was different. 14 months, she said. Who else knows? No one. If I'd told anyone, he'd have moved faster. Yes. Lucien turned back to the front. Something had shifted in the set of his shoulders. Something small and almost invisible that she wouldn't have caught if she hadn't spent 11 months learning the architecture of how he held himself. He said to Dante, the psychiatric notation. Can we challenge it tonight? With the right attorney in front of the right judge, possibly. It's an emergency motion. It's a high bar. Dante's voice was doing its baseline thing, steady and uninflected, just information being transmitted. We'd need grounds to show the notation was filed in bad faith as part of an ongoing pattern of coercive control. We'd need documentation. We have 93 files, Elena said. We have 93 files that were obtained without authorization, Dante said, not unkindly. That affects how they can be used. I have 7 photographs of original documents. That helps. And I have 4 months of personal records, dates, incidents, specific statements he made about Evan. I wrote them down. They're in a document on an encrypted drive that She stopped. That I've been updating every week. Time-stamped. In my own words, everything. Dante and Lucien exchanged a look across the front seat, the specific economy of 2 people who have worked together long enough that a full conversation can happen in 2 seconds of eye contact. Where's the drive? Lucien said. My apartment. We can't go to your apartment tonight. I have a copy. She reached into her evening bag and removed her phone, opened a cloud storage application, navigated 3 folders deep to a file named with a string of numbers that meant nothing to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. I upload every entry the same day I write it, in case he... She didn't finish that sentence. She didn't need to. She turned the phone screen toward Lucian. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at her. You built a case, he said. I built a case. For 14 months. I didn't know when I was going to use it. I just knew I needed it to be there when I did. Something in his face moved. She watched it move and didn't name it and looked back at her phone. The vehicle turned off the expressway, and the specific visual rhythm of highway transit gave way to urban stop and start, streetlights, and pedestrians, and the particular density of a city that never fully committed to sleeping. Meridian Medical was 6 blocks ahead. She could see the hospital tower from the window, its upper floors lit with the permanent yellow-white of a building that ran all night because the things that happened inside it didn't observe business hours. Her phone vibrated. Unknown number. Again. She answered. The voice was female this time, older, with the specific enunciation of someone who had chosen their words very carefully before dialing. Ms. Hartwell, my name is Dr. Cassandra Quinn. I'm an independent cardiologist. I was formerly affiliated with Meridian Medical's pediatric program until 14 months ago when I resigned. A pause. I'm calling because I've been watching what's happening tonight. Someone sent me a partial file directory 20 minutes ago. I think I know what's in those files. Another pause. I left Meridian because I documented what Victor was doing to the priority lists and brought it to the hospital board and was told that my concerns had been reviewed and found to be without merit. Her voice didn't shake, but it had weight in it, the weight of a person who has been carrying something and just found the moment to put it down. I kept my own documentation. I have 2 years of it. If you need a credentialed physician to corroborate the pattern in those files, I'm prepared to do that. Elena was quiet for a moment. Dr. Quinn, she said, where are you right now? I'm in the parking structure at Meridian Medical. A brief pause. I've been here for an hour. I saw the news alerts about the gala, and I drove here, and I've been sitting in my car trying to decide whether to go inside. Another pause, shorter. I think I've decided. Don't go inside yet, Elena said. Wait for us. We're 4 minutes away. She ended the call and looked at Lucien. We have a witness, she said. Something shifted in the vehicle. The atmospheric equivalent of a door opening, of air moving into a closed space. Dante's eyes in the mirror had changed quality, the specific attentiveness of a man who has been running defensive calculations and has just registered a development that changes the arithmetic. Lucien said, That's not enough. I know. The psychiatric notation is still in the system. Even with Quinn, even with the files, Ashcroft has the hospital's legal structure behind him tonight, which means we walk into that building and they may not let you near Evan's room. I know. And if the transport team arrives before we can... I know, Lucien. Her voice came out sharper than she intended, with an edge that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with the size of the thing pressing on her from all directions. She looked at him. I know. I've known the shape of this trap for 14 months. I'm not surprised by it. I'm just... She stopped. The vehicle pulled into the Meridian Medical parking structure, and she saw, 2 rows over, a woman sitting alone in a dark sedan who looked up when the headlights swept across her, a woman in her 50s with short silver hair and the particular posture of someone who had been making a decision for a long time and had just finished making it. Dr. Cassandra Quinn. Elena looked at her. Looked at the hospital entrance 50 yards beyond her. Looked at the elevator bank visible through the lobby glass, the one that went to the 4th floor, to room 412, to a 10-year-old boy who did not know that the man who'd been monitoring his heart for 4 years had spent 14 months using him as a leash. She got out of the vehicle. The November cold hit her full in the face, and she let it, stood in it for the 2 seconds it took Dante and Lucien to come around the vehicle and Quinn to open her door and step out, and she used those 2 seconds to do the thing she'd been doing all night. Take inventory, assess the variables, calculate the distance between where she was and where she needed to be. She had files. She had photographs. She had a personal record. She had a corroborating physician. She had Lucien Voss standing 4 feet to her right, with the expression of a man who had made a decision somewhere in the past hour that she hadn't asked him to make and that he hadn't announced, and that was simply present in the way he was standing, in the direction he was facing. She had 40 minutes, maybe less, before a transport team arrived. And somewhere between the parking structure and the 4th floor of this building, Victor Ashcroft's lawyers had constructed a legal wall with her name on it, designed specifically to stop her at exactly this moment, in exactly this place, when she was exactly this close. She started walking toward the entrance. She was 3 steps from the lobby doors when her phone rang again. She looked at the screen. It was the nursing station on the 4th floor. She answered. Yes? The nurse's voice. Not the careful male voice from before. A different nurse, younger sounding, slightly breathless in the way of someone who has decided to make a call they weren't supposed to make. Ms. Hartwell, I'm not supposed to call you, but The transport team just pulled into the ambulance bay. They have paperwork I've never seen before. It has a court seal on it. I don't know how they got a court order this fast, but it's... Ms. Hartwell, they're coming up in the elevator right. They're coming up in the elevator right. The call dropped. Elena was already running. Not the careful, controlled movement of the parking structure. Not the measured pace of someone managing appearances. Running. The evening heels hit concrete and she pulled them off mid-stride without breaking pace, left them somewhere on the lobby floor, and her feet hit the cold tile in stockings, and she didn't feel it because she wasn't in her body in the way that requires feeling. She was operating on something older and more direct than sensation, the pure functional urgency of a person moving toward the only thing that matters. The lobby of Meridian Medical at 9:40 p.m. was the specific reduced version of a hospital at night. A security desk with 2 guards, a handful of people in the waiting area with the hollow patience of people who have been waiting a long time, fluorescent light doing what fluorescent light does, which is illuminate everything equally and flatteringly for nothing. She hit the elevator bank. Lucien was 2 steps behind her. Dante had split off at the lobby entrance. She'd seen him do it in her peripheral vision, the particular purposeful divergence of someone who has a different task and knows exactly what it is. Quinn was somewhere behind them both, moving with the determined, unhurried stride of a woman who had made her decision in a parking lot and was now simply executing it. The elevator indicator showed car 2 descending. 4th floor. 3rd. The transport team. She hit the stairwell door. 4 flights. She took them the way you take stairs when there's no version of this that involves slowing down. Hand on the rail for the turns, weight forward, the burn in her legs registering somewhere peripheral and irrelevant. Behind her, she heard Lucien's footsteps, steady and close, not falling behind. 3rd floor landing, 4th floor door. She pushed through it. The pediatric cardiac wing at night had a specific quality of muted urgency. Lower light than the day floors, the sound turned down. The particular careful hush of a space designed around the fact that the people inside it needed rest more than almost anything else they needed. Nurses moved with deliberate quietness. Monitors beeped in the specific rhythms of hearts doing their work. The whole floor smelled of antiseptic and something sweeter underneath it. The specific institutional warmth of a children's ward. Room 412 was at the end of the corridor. And standing outside it, consulting a clipboard with the matter-of-fact efficiency of people who have paperwork and believe that paperwork is sufficient authority for most things, were 2 men in medical transport uniforms. One was large and looked at the world with the incurious blankness of someone who drove vehicles for a living and had learned not to ask questions about the cargo. The other was thinner, wore wire-rimmed glasses, and had the specific humorless precision of a hospital administrator who had been dispatched to make sure the logistics went smoothly. Between them and room 412 stood one nurse. She was maybe 26, small, wearing scrubs with a pattern of cartoon stars on them. She had her arms crossed and her chin up, and she was standing in the doorway of room 412 with the particular quality of someone who has decided that their body is going to occupy this specific space regardless of what the paperwork says, and she was saying in a voice kept carefully low for the sake of the ward, "I need to speak to the attending physician before anyone enters this room. That is hospital protocol. That is not negotiable." The administrator said, "The court order supersedes." "I need to speak to the attending physician," the nurse said again, with the repetitive precision of someone who has identified the one sentence available to them and is going to keep saying it until it produces the outcome they need. Elena reached the corridor. The administrator looked up from his clipboard. His eyes moved from her to Lucian behind her with the specific recalibration of someone who has just registered that the situation has developed new variables. "Ms. Hartwell," he said, "I'm afraid I have to inform you that under the terms of the court order filed this evening—" "Let me see it," she said. He hesitated. 1 second. 1 second was enough. She crossed the distance and took the clipboard from his hands before the hesitation resolved into refusal, and she looked at the document. Legal letterhead. A judge's name she didn't recognize. Filed at 9:17 p.m., 23 minutes ago. The language was dense and institutional, and she parsed it with the speed of someone who had spent 4 years in hospital administration reading documents designed to be difficult to read quickly. And what she found in it, underneath the legal structure, was the signature of the attorney who had filed it, Marcus Wieland. She knew that name. She looked up, looked at Lucien. "Wieland filed this," she said. Lucien's expression didn't change, but something moved in his eyes. "Marcus Wieland. You know him. He's on the Meridian Medical Board. He's been on it for 8 years. Lucien's voice was very controlled. "He's also my former attorney. I fired him 3 years ago." The specific quality of that sentence, the thing underneath it, the history it was compressing into 7 words, landed in the corridor, and nobody said anything for a moment. Then Lucien said to the administrator, with a particular quality of quiet that Elena had only heard from him once before, tonight, in a wardrobe room, "The judge on this order, is that Harriet Bowman?" The administrator blinked. That's not, is it Judge Bowman?" A pause. "Yes. Judge Bowman sat on the board of the Ashcroft Foundation's charitable trust for 2 years. She resigned 6 months ago." Lucian looked at the document in Elena's hands. An order signed by a judge with a disclosed prior relationship to the petitioner, filed 23 minutes ago, on a Friday night, through an attorney who currently sits on the hospital board. That order has problems. The administrator opened his mouth. "Large problems," Lucien said. "The kind that make the people who executed it liable for the execution." The large transport man had stopped looking incurious. He was looking at Lucien with the specific attention of someone reassessing whether the thing they'd been told was simple was actually simple. The nurse in the cartoon star scrubs had not moved from the doorway. Elena handed the clipboard back to the administrator. Her hands were steady. She was distantly surprised by that. "My name is Elena Hartwell," she said. "I am the legal guardian of the patient in room 412. I have medical decision-making authority for him that has been in place for 6 years and has not been legally revoked by any court. The psychiatric notation filed against me tonight was submitted by Victor Ashcroft, who is the subject of a federal records inquiry and was not supported by any independent clinical evaluation." She looked at the administrator, then at the transport man, then at the nurse. "No one is moving my brother tonight." The administrator said, "Ms. Hartwell, I understand your position, but the legal documentation is being reviewed," said a new voice. Dr. Cassandra Quinn had arrived at the end of the corridor. She walked toward them with the same steady, unhurried pace she'd had in the parking lot, her silver hair under the fluorescent light giving her the specific authority of someone who has earned the right to take up space in difficult rooms. She had her phone in one hand and what appeared to be a printed document in the other, and she held both with the calm of someone who has been waiting for exactly this moment for 14 months, or possibly 2 years, or possibly longer. "I'm Dr. Cassandra Quinn," she said to the administrator. "I'm a board-certified independent cardiologist. I'm also a former Meridian medical staff physician who filed an internal complaint against Dr. Ashcroft 26 months ago that this institution buried." She looked at the document in her hand. "I've spent the last 20 minutes on the phone with the New York State Department of Health emergency line. They are opening an inquiry into the transfer order and the psychiatric notation filed tonight. Pending that inquiry, they have requested that Meridian Medical take no irreversible action regarding any patient under Dr. Ashcroft's care." She handed the document to the administrator. "That's a confirmation number. You can call the DOH directly." The administrator looked at the document. The transport man looked at his partner. The nurse in the cartoon star scrubs exhaled very quietly, the specific exhale of someone who has been holding their breath for longer than they realized. It should have been enough. It should have been the moment the pressure eased, the moment the machinery started moving in a different direction, the moment Elena could put her hand on the door to room 412 and push it open and see her brother asleep in the dark, and understand that the worst of it was over. Victor walked out of the elevator. He came out of the elevator at the end of the corridor with one of his security people and the specific quality of presence he carried in public spaces. Large, purposeful, wearing the expression of a man arriving to manage a situation that has gotten out of hand through no fault of his own. He'd changed from the gala, jacket off, sleeves rolled, the deliberate aesthetic of a physician interrupted from something important. He'd calculated that. She knew he'd calculated it. He walked down the corridor and everyone watched him walk, and the corridor felt smaller than it had been. He stopped 12 feet away. He looked at Elena. She looked back at him. In 14 months of knowing what he was, she had never been able to entirely inoculate herself against what he did when he looked at her directly. The specific effect of his attention, its weight and focus. The way it had felt in the beginning, like being truly seen, and had revealed itself, slowly, and then all at once, to be something else entirely. Something that had nothing to do with seeing her and everything to do with measuring the distance between what she was and what he needed her to be. She felt it now. She held it. Elena. His voice was what it always was in private, quieter than his public voice, textured differently. The voice that had said her name in the dark for 14 months. This is not what you want. Any of this. He looked at Lucien, back at her. You're tired. You've been carrying something that was too heavy for one person, and I understand that. I have not... He stopped. Recalibrated. I have not been the person I should have been. I know that. But Evan, don't, she said. Evan needs continuity of care. The relationships I have with his surgical team, the specific protocols we've built for his condition, Don't say his name, she said. Don't put his name in your mouth right now. Something moved in his face. The careful architecture of it shifted, just slightly, and underneath it she saw the thing she'd seen in the wardrobe room of the Voss Financial Center 6 floors in a lifetime ago. The thing that looked like hurt, and was actually the specific expression of a man who has been told no and doesn't believe he should ever be told no. You have no idea, he said, and the warmth had gone from his voice completely, and what was left was the thing she'd heard at 4 a.m. in rooms she'd tried to forget. What I have done to make sure that boy stays alive. The calls I've made, the favors I've spent, the board members I've managed. Without me, Evan is a case number. Without me, he waits 18 months for a surgery he needs in 6. His voice stayed low, but it had changed register entirely, private and precise, and aimed at exactly the places he knew to aim. You want to walk away from that. You want to burn all of it down because you're angry. That's your right. But Evan doesn't get to have feelings about it. Evan just gets the consequences. The corridor was very quiet. The administrator had stopped consulting his clipboard. The transport men had stopped looking at each other. Elena's heart was beating in her ears, steady and hard. And she was aware of it the way she was aware of the cold tile under her stockinged feet, and the weight of the evening bag on her shoulder, and the specific distance between her and room 412, 7 feet and a door, behind which a 10-year-old boy who didn't know any of this was alive because his heart kept beating despite the fact that it was imperfectly made and had kept beating for 10 years. And she had been standing between him and everything that wanted to stop it since the day their parents were gone. She said, Dr. Quinn. Quinn stepped forward. Tell him, Elena said. Tell him what you have. Quinn looked at Victor. She looked at him the way a person looks at something they've been turning away from for a long time and have finally decided to face directly. I have documentation of 47 cases over 2 years showing correlation between donor levels and surgical priority adjustment in the pediatric cardiac program. I have internal communications showing you were aware of and directing those adjustments. I have the case of a 7-year-old girl named Petra Weiss, who waited 4 additional months for a procedure because her family had not donated to the foundation, and who suffered a secondary cardiac event during that waiting period that she did not fully recover from. Quinn's voice was absolutely level. I brought this to the Meridian Board 26 months ago. They buried it. I have that documentation too. Victor looked at her. The thing in his face had gone very still. And you, Quinn said, told me in this building, in a conference room on the 8th floor, that if I filed an external complaint, you would make sure I never held a medical license in this state again." She paused. "I was afraid. I left. I have regretted it every day for 2 years." She looked at him for another moment. "I'm not afraid tonight." Victor turned to his security man, said something low that Elena didn't catch. And then, later she would think about this moment, about the specific decision it represented, the calculation that had clearly gone wrong inside him, the point at which whatever was still holding the performance together finally gave way. He moved toward the door of room 412, not toward Elena, not toward Quinn, toward the door, toward Evan. Lucian stepped into his path. They were approximately the same height. The difference was everything else. Lucian, in his gala shirt with his jacket, shed somewhere in the last 20 minutes, standing in the corridor of a pediatric cardiac ward at 9:50 p.m., with the stillness he always had. Except tonight, it was a different kind of stillness, the kind that wasn't watchful or controlled but simply immovable. A person who has decided that this is as far as the thing goes and is prepared for whatever that decision costs. Victor stopped. "Move," he said. "No." One word. The same word he'd said in the ballroom. Still no microphone. Still carrying. Victor looked at him with the expression of a man recalculating. The security guard behind him shifted his weight forward, and Dante materialized from the stairwell door at the end of the corridor. Elena hadn't known he was there, hadn't heard the door. He was simply suddenly present the way Dante was, sometimes simply suddenly present. And the guard looked at Dante and stopped shifting. "This is criminal trespass," Victor said. To Lucien. His voice had found the public register again, the warm, authoritative one, reaching for it, the way a drowning person reaches for something floating. "This is interference with a legitimate medical procedure. I will have you—" "You'll have me what?" Lucien said. Victor stared at him. "Finish it," Lucien said. "Tell me what you'll do. Tell everyone in this corridor what you'll do." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "You've been doing this for 14 months. You've been telling people what you'll do to them if they don't cooperate. And it worked, because you picked people who couldn't fight back, people who had something you could threaten." He looked at Victor with an expression Elena had not seen on his face before, something that was not anger and not contempt, but was perhaps the specific look of a man who has spent a lifetime around a certain category of person and is done pretending not to recognize it. "I don't have anything you can threaten." Victor's jaw moved. His phone rang. He didn't look at it. It rang again. He pulled it out, looked at the screen. Something changed in his face in a way that was different from everything else that had changed in it tonight. This was not calculation failing. This was something arriving that he hadn't expected, information landing that the performance couldn't process fast enough to contain, and the result was a fraction of a second in which the face of Victor Ashcroft showed something that it had never shown in any of the 300 rooms he'd been the most trusted man in. Fear. Real fear. The kind that comes not from a threat you can manage, but from a door you cannot close fast enough. He looked up from the phone. He looked at Elena. "Federal investigators," she said. She didn't know that. She was reading his face the way she'd learned to read it, the way you learn to read the faces of people you live in close proximity to, danger with. "Dante sent the files." Victor's security man said something in his ear. Victor looked at the door of room 412. He looked at Lucien. He looked at Quinn. He looked at Elena one last time, and in that look was the entire 14 months compressed into a single moment. The bruises, the threats, Evan's name used like a tool, the 4 a.m. silences and the charity galas, and the smile that the city adored and the hand that came down in the dark when the smiling was done. All of it in one look, and she held it without flinching. Held it the way she'd been unable to hold it for 14 months, because she'd needed to look away in order to survive. And she did not look away now. Victor turned and walked back toward the elevator. His security man followed. The elevator doors opened. They got in. The doors closed. The corridor was very quiet. The nurse in cartoon star scrubs let out a breath that was almost, not quite, a sound. Elena walked to the door of room 412 and put her hand flat on the surface of it and stood there for a moment with her palm against the door, feeling the specific cool solidity of it, the fact of it, the simple physical reality of a door between her and her brother that no one was trying to open from the wrong side. From inside the room, A small voice, sleep-rough and slightly confused. "Ellie?" She pushed the door open. The room was dark except for the ambient light of the monitors, the specific blue-green glow of machines tracking the work of a small, imperfect heart doing its best. Evan was sitting up in bed, 10 years old and mussed from sleep, his hospital gown slightly twisted, his face carrying the particular expression of a child who has sensed that something has been happening in the adult world and is trying to decide if he should know about it. "Hey," Elena said. Her voice came out wrong. She let it. "Why are you in a fancy dress?" Evan said. She sat on the edge of his bed. "I had a thing." "What kind of thing?" "The boring kind." She put her hand on his head, felt the warmth of him, the specific living warmth of a person who is alive and present and real. "Go back to sleep." He looked at her for a moment with the direct, unfiltered assessment that children apply to the faces of adults they trust. Then he said, "You okay?" She looked at him. Behind her, through the open door, she could hear the corridor, Lucien's voice, low on his phone. Quinn talking to the nurse, somewhere distant the sound of an elevator arriving, and further off the specific ambient sound of a hospital at night. All the monitored rhythms of lives being sustained and tended, the enormous quiet industry of people keeping other people alive. "Yeah," she said, "I'm okay." Evan looked at her for another second. Then he lay back down and pulled the blanket up and closed his eyes with the uncomplicated trust of someone who has been told a thing by someone they believe. Elena sat on the edge of his bed in a ballroom gown with no shoes and her hands in her lap. And she did not cry because crying was something she'd defer to a room without a 10-year-old in it, and she sat there until his breathing evened out, and then she sat there a little longer. In the corridor, her phone buzzed. Dante, a message. 2 lines. Federal OIG confirmed. Opening formal inquiry tonight. They want the files. Ashcroft's attorneys just filed an injunction. Judge Bowman denied it. She read it twice. She looked at Evan's face in the monitor light, the soft, unguarded face of a sleeping child, and she thought about a 7-year-old girl named Petra Weiss who had waited 4 months longer than she should have and suffered for it. And she thought about 47 cases over 2 years. And she thought about the memo in her photographs that had used the words "my cooperation" to describe the terms of her brother's survival. And she felt something shift in her chest that was not relief and not rage, but was something that occupied the space where both of those had been living for 14 months. Something that felt, cautiously and without full commitment yet, like the beginning of the end of the wait. She got up from the bed. She went to the door. Lucien was in the corridor, leaning against the wall opposite, his phone in his hand and his jacket gone and his shirt slightly wrong at the collar from the evening's physics. And he looked up when she appeared in the doorway, and they looked at each other across the corridor. Width in the specific silence of people who have just come through something together and haven't yet figured out what language to use for what comes. They looked at each other across the corridor width in the specific silence of people who have just come through something together and haven't yet figured out what language to use for what comes next. Lucien didn't say anything. Elena didn't say anything. The monitors beeped softly behind her through the open door, the steady percussion of a small heart doing its work, and the corridor hummed with the reduced nighttime frequency of a hospital that had not stopped but had shifted into a lower register. And somewhere at the end of the hall, a nurse was writing something in a chart, with the unhurried attention of someone doing a thing they've done 10,000 times. It was 10:14 p.m., 4 hours since the wardrobe room. Elena looked down at her feet, bare against the cold tile, stockings with a run in them from somewhere in the last hour that she hadn't noticed happening. She looked at her hands. They weren't shaking anymore. She wasn't sure when they'd stopped. "I need to sit down," she said. Lucien pushed off the wall and opened the door to the family consultation room across the corridor. A small room with chairs and a table and the specific careful neutrality of a space designed for difficult conversations, beige walls and soft lighting, and a box of tissues on the table that was the saddest piece of furniture Elena had ever seen. He held the door. She walked in. She sat in the chair nearest the wall and put her elbows on her knees and her face in her hands and stayed there for a moment, not crying, just existing in the specific posture of someone who has been running on emergency power for hours and has just found 30 seconds in which nothing is actively on fire. She heard Lucien sit in the chair across from her. She heard him not say anything. After a moment, she lifted her face from her hands. Victor isn't done, she said. No. The federal inquiry buys time. It doesn't end it. It changes the terrain, Lucian said. He spent the last 14 months operating in a space where he was the most trusted person in every room. That's gone now. Every move he makes from here goes on record. Every attorney he calls tonight is going to tell him the same thing. His attorneys have kept worse things quiet. His attorneys didn't have 93 files and Cassandra Quinn and a ballroom full of witnesses before tonight. Elena looked at the tissue box, looked away from it. He's going to go after Evan's care, not the transfer. That's blocked now. But the continuity of treatment, the surgical team relationships, the specific cardiologist familiarity that actually matters for a kid with Evan's condition. He's going to make sure that whatever happens to him, Evan feels some version of it. That's what independent oversight is for, Lucian. And said, Quinn has agreed to take point on transitioning Evan's care to an independent team. Not affiliated with Meridian, not within Victor's network. She knows every pediatric cardiac specialist in the city and most of the ones on the East Coast. He paused. Evan's care doesn't go through Victor Ashcroft again. Ever. Elena heard that sentence and felt it go somewhere inside her that had been braced for a very long time. She didn't respond immediately because the response that came up first was not one she wanted to have in this room with this person, and she pressed it down with the particular discipline she'd been applying to things she didn't want to feel for 14 months and was dimly aware was going to have to stop working at some point. Thank you, she said instead. It came out rough. Lucian looked at her for a moment. You don't have to do that. Do what? Thank me like I did you a favor. You built the case. You carried it for 14 months in the right direction. You were the one who walked into that ballroom. You were the one who got on the stage. I had the microphone. You had the evidence. He looked at his hands briefly, then back at her. Those aren't the same thing. She looked at him across the table in the soft beige light of the consultation room and thought about the wardrobe room at 7:14 p.m. and the specific quality of the silence when he'd first seen her back. The things she'd watched move through his face before he'd locked it down. She'd been so busy managing the situation, managing her own reaction to being seen, managing the threat assessment of what he knowing meant, managing the calculation of what to do next, that she hadn't sat with what it had actually been like to be seen. It had been like putting something down that she'd forgotten had weight because she'd been carrying it so long. She wasn't going to say that. Dante has the full filing package, Lucian said. Everything goes to the federal OIG, the State Department of Health, and the State Attorney General's office tonight. Quinn is on record as a corroborating witness. The ballroom footage from tonight, 3 separate event cameras plus whatever's on people's phones, is being preserved. The documents are in the hands of 2 journalists who I know will run them responsibly. He paused. Victor Ashcroft is going to have a very different Tuesday than he had last Tuesday. His foundation, Elena said. The children. The foundation's board will be notified of the inquiry tonight. The 47 documented cases get reopened. The children whose care was compromised. Their families get notification, independent review, remediation where it's still possible. He said the last part carefully, with the specific care of someone who understands that not everything is remediable. Not everything can be fixed, but it gets looked at. All of it. Elena thought about Petra Weiss, 7 years old, 4 months longer than she should have waited. A secondary cardiac event she didn't fully recover from. She thought about the family who had not donated enough to a foundation they probably didn't know existed, who had spent those 4 months believing that their daughter was waiting because that was simply how long things took, that the system was slow but the system was honest. She thought about what it meant to know otherwise, to know that the slowness had a reason and the reason had a name, and the name had a face that smiled on magazine covers. She felt something cold and permanent settle into the place in her chest where the fear had been. It's not enough, she said. For Petra Weiss, it's not enough. No, Lucian said. It's not. He didn't try to make it more than that. She'd worked alongside him for nearly a year, and she knew this about him. He didn't reach for comfort language when comfort language was dishonest, didn't smooth things over when the roughness of them was the truth. It was one of the things she'd come to rely on without examining why she relied on it. She stood up. I'm going to stay with Evan tonight, she said. There's a cot in the room. Lucian stood as well. I'll have someone outside the door. She nodded, moved toward the door of the consultation room, stopped with her hand on the frame, and stood there for a moment, not fully in the room and not fully out of it, in the specific transitional space of someone who has more to say and is deciding whether to say it. In the wardrobe room, she said, without turning around. When you saw my back, what did you do after you left? A pause behind her. I went downstairs, he said. I shook hands with people. I had 2 conversations I don't remember. I thought about what you told me about Evan. Another pause, shorter. I thought about the fact that you'd been coming to work for almost a year with that underneath your clothes, and I hadn't seen it. She turned then, looked at him. I should have seen it, he said. There was no performance in it, just the flat, honest weight of a person who has reviewed something and found themselves inadequate in it. You couldn't have seen it, she said. I was very careful. I know. That's also a thing I thought about. She held his gaze for a moment longer than was neutral. Then she said, Good night, Lucien, and walked across the corridor and into room 412, and the door swung gently shut behind her. She stood in the dark for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the monitor light, and then she looked at Evan asleep in the bed, his chest rising and falling with the regular rhythm of someone deeply, genuinely asleep, the kind of sleep that belongs to people who don't know what's been moving around them. And she felt something break open in her chest in the specific way that things break open when you have been holding them closed with force for a very long time and the force is no longer needed. She sat in the chair beside his bed. She didn't cry exactly. It was more like pressure releasing, a long, slow exhale from somewhere deeper than her lungs, the specific physical sensation of a body letting go of the posture it has been holding in preparation for impact, the standing down of muscles that had forgotten how to rest. Evan slept. She watched him breathe. After a while, she lay down on the cot in the corner and closed her eyes, and the monitors beeped their steady count. And outside the window, the city went on in its enormous, indifferent way, and she slept. Victor Ashcroft was arrested at 6:47 a.m. on a Saturday at the entrance of his apartment building on the Upper East Side. 2 federal agents and 1 state investigator. No drama in the arrest itself, just the specific procedural efficiency of people who have done this before. The quiet management of a thing that could have been loud and was instead handled with the particular institutional calm that comes from having sufficient paperwork. He was wearing a dark overcoat. He did not make a statement. His attorney, who had been called at 6:15, arrived too late to do anything useful. Elena was not there to see it. She was asleep in a cot in room 412 when it happened, one hand extended toward the edge of Evan's bed in the unconscious way of someone who has spent years making sure the thing they love is within reach. And she didn't learn about the arrest until 7:20, when Dante sent a message that said simply, "Done." And she lay there for a moment, reading that single word and feeling its dimensions. Done, not over. She understood the difference. There would be hearings and depositions and the long, grinding institutional machinery of accountability, which moved slowly and imperfectly, and sometimes not at all. And she would be inside that process for months, possibly years, as a primary witness and complainant and the person whose name was on most of the documentation. There would be days when the slowness of it felt like injustice. Days when Victor's attorneys would do what attorneys do, and the paperwork would multiply, and the headlines would move on to the next thing, and the people in this city who had called him a hero would gradually revise that opinion with the specific, quiet efficiency of people who prefer not to have been wrong. But this morning, in a hospital room in Manhattan, with Evan asleep 3 feet away and a message on her phone that said, "Done," Elena Hartwell allowed herself to believe, cautiously, and without full commitment, and with the specific reserve of someone who has been surprised badly before, that the worst of it was behind her. 3 weeks passed. The Ashcroft Foundation's board suspended operations on day 4 of the federal inquiry. By day 9, 6 board members had resigned. By day 14, the foundation's financial records had been subpoenaed, and 3 additional physicians had come forward with documentation of their own, each of them having carried what Quinn had carried: the knowledge of something wrong, the institutional pressure to stay quiet, the specific private cost of that silence accumulating over years. 47 cases became 61. Meridian Medical's CEO resigned. The hospital's board commissioned an independent review and hired outside counsel and issued a statement that used words like deeply troubled in systemic failures and commitment to reform that meant different things depending on who was reading them. Elena read the statement once and put it down and didn't read it again. Evan's care was transferred to a team led by Dr. Quinn and a pediatric cardiologist named Dr. Asha Mehta, who had been recommended by 3 separate independent physicians and who sat with Elena for 2 hours on a Tuesday afternoon going through Evan's complete medical history with the specific attentive thoroughness of someone who is starting from the premise that everything she's been told should be verified rather than assumed. After that meeting, Elena sat in the hospital cafeteria for 20 minutes drinking bad coffee and feeling the specific disorientation of realizing that something she'd been braced against for 4 years, the possibility that Evan's care would be disrupted, that the expertise maintaining his life would be removed, had been replaced, gradually and without announcement, by something that looked like its actual opposite. Evan came home from the hospital on a Wednesday. He walked out of the elevator in his coat and backpack with the particular restored energy of a 10-year-old who has spent 2 weeks in a hospital bed and is done with that. And he spent the car ride home asking Elena questions about whether they could get a dog, and whether she would let him stay up late on Friday, and whether it was true that the surgery he needed was going to happen before his birthday, and Elena answered each question in order, and the answer to the dog question was maybe, and the answer to the Friday question was yes, and the answer to the surgery question was yes, with a good team, and Evan accepted all 3 answers with the equanimity of someone whose fundamental optimism has not yet been seriously tested by the world. And Elena looked at his profile in the back seat and felt something she had not let herself feel for so long she'd almost forgotten its texture. Ordinary love, without fear underneath it, just the thing itself. She went back to work. Voss Financial Center on a Monday morning, 3 weeks after the gala, carrying coffee in a paper cup and her bag on her shoulder, and the specific quality of a person who is returning to a familiar place from a significant distance and is not sure yet what it will feel like to be there. The lobby guard nodded at her. The elevator opened on 34 without her having to do anything. Her desk was exactly as she'd left it. Someone had watered the plant on the windowsill while she was gone. She stood in her office for a moment looking at the plant and thinking about who had watered it and feeling a small warmth at the thought. She sat down, opened her laptop, began. It was ordinary, which was the specific extraordinary quality of it. The ordinariness, the absence of the low-frequency vigilance she'd been operating under for 14 months. The attention she'd spent on threat mapping now available for other things. The cognitive resources that had been allocated to survival now allocated to work. And the work was good, and she was good at it, and the morning passed in the way that good mornings pass, which is without incident. At noon, she walked down the corridor toward Lucien's office to deliver a briefing document, which was a thing she had done hundreds of times, and she was aware that it was a thing she had done hundreds of times while carrying something she was no longer carrying, and the lightness of not carrying it was still strange enough that she noticed it. She knocked. "Come in." She went in, placed the document on his desk, was turning to leave when she saw it. On the corner of his desk, beside the second monitor, in a position that was either intentional or the result of having been placed there and not moved, a single sheet of paper, not a printed document. Handwriting. His handwriting, which she recognized from the marginalia he left on documents he reviewed, angular and compressed and slightly leftward in its slant. She shouldn't have read it. She read the first line before she'd made the decision not to, and after the first line, the decision was academic. If staying feels like another cage, leave. She stood very still. If leaving feels like fear, stay. She read the second line twice. Either way, choose for yourself. The office was quiet. Outside the window, the city was doing what it always did, indifferent and enormous, 1 billion lit windows going about their business. A FedEx truck was double parked on the street 34 floors below. A woman was walking a very small dog with the specific focused determination of someone late for something. The world going on in its ordinary way, with its ordinary traffic and its ordinary people and its ordinary small daily urgencies that had nothing to do with federal investigations or pediatric cardiac wards or what it cost a person to make a decision in a ballroom under fabricated evidence with a hand on their spine. Elena looked at the note for a long moment. Then she put the briefing document back on the desk and picked up the pen from beside it and turned the note over and wrote on the back of it with the particular clarity that comes from knowing exactly what you want to say. Coffee. 8 a.m. No locked doors. She put the pen down. She left the office. Oh, she was there at 7:58 the next morning, standing in the corridor outside his office with 2 coffees from the place on the ground floor that made it correctly and charged too much for it, wearing her coat because she'd come straight from outside and hadn't taken it off yet, and the morning light came through the corridor windows in the specific flat winter way of early December in New York, gray-white and without warmth but present, doing its job. She heard him before she saw him. The specific quality of his footsteps in the corridor, which she'd learned to distinguish from everyone else's in 11 months of working on the same floor, the particular cadence of someone who walks like they've decided where they're going. He came around the corner and saw her. He stopped. She held up one of the coffees. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she'd catalogued 11 months ago and never fully decoded. The one that existed in the space between his controlled external register and whatever was underneath it, the look she'd spent nearly a year declining to examine because examining it was a door she hadn't been able to afford to open. She was looking at it now. He walked toward her, and then he did the thing she hadn't anticipated. Didn't reach for the door to his office, didn't gesture toward it, didn't put the architecture of the space between them and the conversation they were about to have. He stopped in the corridor beside her and took the coffee from her hand and stood there, in the morning light, in the corridor, meeting her where she was. No desk between them, no title, no performance. Just 2 people standing in a corridor with coffee at 8 in the morning, which was the most ordinary thing in the world, and was, for that specific reason, the most significant thing that had happened in this building since 7:14 p.m. 3 weeks ago. "I read your note," she said. "I know. I saw the pen moved." "You left it on purpose?" "Yes." "Where I'd find it?" "Yes." She looked at him. That was presumptuous. It was. "I could have just left." "You could have." She considered him for a moment. The morning light did something specific to his face in the way that honest light does. Showed it without the controlled neutrality he wore in most rooms. Showed something in it that was not the carefully managed register of a man running an empire, but the face of a person who had spent 3 weeks thinking about something and had decided to be direct about it, even though directness was a form of risk. She understood risk. "I'm not doing anything that looks like what I was doing," she said. "I need to be clear about that. Not for a long time. Maybe not ever. I know. And I'm still your employee, which is a complication that doesn't get simpler by ignoring it. Also true. And I have a brother with a surgery coming up and a deposition in 6 weeks, and I'm sleeping approximately 4 hours a night, and I'm not—" She stopped. "I'm not in a place where I'm fully intact. You should know that. I know that too." He looked at her with the directness she'd come to recognize as his specific form of honesty, the kind that didn't dress itself up. "I'm not asking you to be intact. I'm asking if you want to have coffee." She looked at him. She thought about the wardrobe room, the note, the corridor outside room 412, the way he'd stood in front of a door and said no and meant it with his entire body, the way he'd stepped off a stage without being asked because it was the right thing to do, the way he'd said I should have seen it without making the admission into something that required her management. She thought about the difference between a person who needed you to be a certain thing in order to stay, and a person who could stand in a corridor at 8 in the morning and simply meet you where you were. She took a sip of her own coffee. "I want to have coffee," she said. He didn't smile exactly, but something in his face changed in a way that was in the vicinity of a smile. The specific movement of someone who has been holding something carefully and has just been told it's safe to put it down. They stood in the corridor and drank their coffee in the flat December light, not talking for a moment, not filling the silence with anything it didn't need, just 2 people occupying a shared space with the particular quality of ease that can't be performed or rushed, that has to be arrived at through the specific slow accumulation of known things. Below them, the city went about its morning. 6 weeks later, Victor Ashcroft was formally indicted on 7 counts, including healthcare fraud, coercive control, and conspiracy to obstruct a federal investigation. The indictment named 61 patients. It named Petra Weiss specifically. It named Evan Hartwell in the context of documented coercion, which was a different kind of naming. Not a list, not a number, but a case, a story, a specific account of what had been done to a specific child through the deliberate manipulation of the one thing his sister would never risk. Elena read the indictment in her apartment at 9 in the evening with a glass of water on the table beside her and the television off. She read it the way you read something you've been building toward for a long time. Carefully, completely, not skimming, giving each paragraph its due weight. When she finished, she put the document down and sat for a moment in the quiet of her apartment, which was a different quiet than it had been for 14 months. Less the absence of something threatening, and more simply the presence of the ordinary evening, the ambient sounds of the building and the street, and Evan's video game controller clicking softly from his room. She thought about Petra Weiss's parents reading the same document. She thought about all the rooms she'd been in where she hadn't said anything because the cost of saying something had been Evan's life. She thought about the fact that she'd said it anyway, finally, standing in a ballroom in a torn evening blouse with her hands shaking and the entire fabricated weight of Victor's preparation aimed directly at her, and that she'd said it without permission and without a guarantee and without knowing how it would end, just because the moment had arrived and she'd recognized it with her whole body and moved. She was 33 years old. She was not intact. She was not broken either. She was something in the process of becoming itself, which was a different and considerably more complicated thing than either, and it required patience and time and the willingness to let the reconstruction happen at the pace it needed rather than the pace she preferred, and she was working on all of that, imperfectly and with some resistance, which was the only way she knew how to work on anything. Her phone lit up. A message from Lucien. Not urgent. She'd learned his specific texting register over 12 months and knew the difference. Just, Quinn confirms Evan's pre-surgical blood work looks good. Then, a second later, how are you? She looked at the two messages for a moment. The first one practical and kind. The second one a question that was not a check-in but a genuine inquiry, the kind of question that didn't need to be asked unless the person asking it actually wanted to know the answer. She typed, "Better than yesterday. Ask me again tomorrow." His reply came back in about 15 seconds. "I will." She set down the phone. She looked at her apartment, the ordinary geography of a life, books and a lamp and a coat on the hook by the door. And through the wall, the sound of Evan's game, the specific domestic texture of two people sharing space in the way of people who have always shared space and don't notice anymore that it's something to be grateful for. She noticed. She picked up her glass of water and went to Evan's door and knocked once and pushed it open. He was on his bed with the controller in his hands and his headset on and the particular full-body engagement of a 10-year-old playing something that required his entire attention, and he looked up when she appeared and pushed the headset off one ear. "What?" "Nothing, just checking." He looked at her with the evaluating look he'd been giving her for 3 weeks, the one that was quieter and more watchful than his usual unguarded expression, the one that told her he understood more than she'd told him, because children always understand more than you've told them, especially children who have spent years in hospitals and have learned to read the faces of adults who are trying to protect them. "I'm fine," he said. "I know." "You keep checking." "I know." He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, with the particular combination of exasperation and affection that was his specific register for her, the one she'd been hearing since he was 4 years old, "You can come in if you want." She came in. She sat on the end of his bed and he put his headset back on and went back to his game, and she sat there in the glow of the screen and the ordinary evening noise of a 10-year-old doing a 10-year-old thing, and she didn't say anything and he didn't say anything, and neither of them needed to. Outside the window, New York moved through its night. Everything that had happened was still true. Everything that needed to be answered for was in the process of being answered for. Everything that had been broken would take longer to heal than she wanted it to, and some of it wouldn't heal fully, and she was learning to hold that fact without it collapsing her, which was a different skill than the one she'd been using for the past 14 months, and was, she was discovering, considerably harder. But Evan's heart was beating. She was in the room. No one had their hand on the door from the outside. She had chosen to be here, in this specific chair, in this specific life, without being threatened into it and without being locked into it, just chosen it because it was hers and she wanted it, which was the smallest and most significant freedom she knew. The game played on. The city moved. The night passed the way nights pass when you are no longer afraid of what they contain. Slowly, ordinarily, without incident, each hour becoming the next one in the steady, unhurried way of time that belongs to you, only to you, and to no one else.